how do American high schools compare with high schools in other countries?
I am from France, and I don't want to generalize, but as for I know about the 3 different high schools I visited, we learn more in France.
I'm from India, and I think the schools in my country manage to get much more work done in class. However, those here are very much more interesting and much more informal.
I'm from the United Kingdom, and I feel that students of different ability should be put into different schools so that each group can progress at its own speed.
I am from Lebanon. From my personal experience in my 2-month stay in the United States, and from my experience at my own school, the International College of the American University of Beirut, I can say that the American type of education is the best and is needed and wanted all over the world.
Welcome to The World We Want, a television presentation of the New York Herald Tribune Forum for High Schools. For the 11th year, the Herald Tribune, in cooperation with Pan American World Airways, Trans World Airlines, and Scholastic Magazines, has brought some 33 students from as many countries to spend 3 months in the United States as guests in our high school communities in the northeastern area. Each of the students is the winner of a nationwide competition in his own country, sponsored by the Ministry of Education. During the past week, the entire group, or past 2 weeks rather, has had a most interesting trip together to Richmond, Williamsburg, Hampton Institute, where we spent 2 days as guests of the Institute, and Washington, D.C. for a week. Just a few days ago, all of the students had the opportunity to shake hands and visit with President Eisenhower at the White House. The subject for this discussion, comparing American high schools with those in other countries, will be presented by a panel of 4 forum students. Let me introduce them to you now. Ziad Husami from Lebanon, from France, Catherine Arcel, from the United Kingdom, Sarah Chat, and from India, Padmanabh Gopinath, whom we call Gopi. As a matter of fact, every time we get on this subject of education, there is so much interest that several other forum delegates have come to the studio tonight, and they may intervene in the discussion as they will. As a matter of fact, here is Young-Koo Lee from Korea. Do you want to start us off in the discussion, Young-Koo?
Yes. Each of us has now spent 2 weeks in 3 different American high schools, going to school every day, participating in classroom discussions, learning about your country, and talking about our own. We have found the great differences between your school system and ours. We argue heatedly among ourselves about whether the differences we have found here make your schools better or worse than ours. But on one point, nearly all of us agree. American high school students do not show enough respect for their teachers. It is as if you have turned the whole social structure upside down. In Korea, scholars have the most social prestige. Second come the farmers, then the engineers, and last, the merchants. Here it seems to be just the opposite. Merchants, businessmen seem to be most highly regarded. Then the engineers and professional people, then the farmers, and last of all, teachers and intellectuals. I ask myself whether this may not be the basis of most of your educational problems.
In Lebanon, we have in our French schools the same prestige enjoyed by the teachers that the Korean teachers enjoy. The students are supposed to listen to the teacher, absorb everything, and mostly learn by heart what is in their textbooks. The teacher would carry out his program without any regard to his students' opinion. In my school, it's an American school, we have the French system, but we apply it with the American spirit. We have full discussions on every fact we study because we believe that education is a continuous flow of knowledge between the student and the teacher. Learning is a give and take process. The student has to contribute something, for he will be more interested in the lesson if he does.
But I think there is overemphasis in the classroom discussions in American high schools I visited here. Often these discussions degenerate into mere arguments with inadequate knowledge of basic facts. It's all very well to hear what the other fellow has to say, but he must say something worthwhile.
But what Ziad and Gopi are saying seems to me to be rather a big contradiction in this American system of education. After all, in the classrooms, you seem to be encouraging the students to use their minds and to think well in discussions. And yet you come to examinations and you use a type of test which deliberately stunts original thought. These type of objective tests often contain purposefully ambiguous choices or inadequate answers. I've taken some, and I myself feel frustrated when I have to choose a question which I would prefer to discuss or reframe. And also I feel that these type of objective tests are very harmful to the students because they have a couldn't care less attitude. They feel they needn't really learn their work because after all, when they get to the examination, the actual paper itself will jolt their memory. And I feel it's bad for the teacher too, because you can only see the mind of the pupil developing through written work. And the student often works to please his teacher. And how on earth can a student work to please a machine?
Well, I'm glad that you don't have so much of the American system in Lebanon to take this objective type of tests, which are corrected by a machine. But to be honest, though, I must admit that we have something mechanical about our system of examination. As if it was the aim of my teacher is to make me pass the governmental exams of the 25th of June, not to educate me as a good human being. They stuff our minds so full of facts that we hardly have time to assimilate them fully. I think that a mind spoils if you use it for storage instead of for thinking.
Listen, Ziad. Maybe you haven't understood the essence of the French educational system. I am French, and I've noticed that my intellectual level of education is higher than American students of my age. For example, I have not been able to find an American high school that teaches philosophy, which is my main course in the last year of high school. Students here take courses like band and gym and glee club. Music courses might be all right if they learned musical theory instead of the cha-cha-cha.
Well, but I disagree really with you totally. What is the purpose of an education? The average man is not much concerned with theories. He is practical enough to ask for a system that will give him a better living and will enable him to decide his destiny.
Destiny is a big word. What ideas are directing the destiny of most of mankind today? They are ideas of democracy that were given to the masses by intellectuals, many of them French.
Yeah, but when you give education for the elite, you do not benefit the whole society. Now, that's what happened in most countries. Certain group, the intellectuals, were educated, and they were responsible for the whole nation. But what happened? The masses were left out. They did nothing for the advancement of the country. Now, when a social disease occurs in my country, the masses would say this is the mistake of the government, and the government has to correct it. They do nothing to correct it, while here I can find that they are responsible. I mean, they are doing so. The whole masses feel that they have to do so. More than that, there are plenty of masses in the world who want their freedom, and they are being prevented from having it mostly by France.
Look, you two, let's get off this political question and get back to
This
education.
is the first time a British stops a fight and does not begin
Yes,
it.
quite right.
So you can see the American influence regarding our British delegates.
This is probably the colonial policy. We
Right.
both share the same question. But Katrine, let's get back onto education. I think you were saying that French system was better than the American one.
Yes,
Was that okay?
yes, Sarah. I was just saying that American students are not as serious about their studies as we are and don't work nearly so hard. I've seen many girls wandering and fooling around in the halls. I met also many girls whose main purpose in going to high school seems to get an engagement ring as soon as possible. When a teacher has a rich vocabulary, the students complain they can't understand instead of wanting to learn words of Latin and Greek roots. American students seem to think that to be serious means to be old.
Yes, Nona from Indonesia?
American students have so many things we don't have in Indonesia, but they don't appreciate them half enough. They can get things so easily. They just ask and they get it. But when they've got it, they don't use it. I met a girl here. She had a beautiful watch. She dropped it and it stopped. I was almost crying, but she laughed and said to me, "Don't worry, I'll ask another one for my birthday." It came so easily out of her mouth. I wanted a watch from the time I was 15. My mother promised me one if I worked hard and graduated to a higher class. So I worked hard the whole year long. I managed it. I graduated. But my mother couldn't give me the watch. The money which she saved for it wasn't enough yet. I was disappointed, but I understood. Trusting my mother, I looked forward to the time that the watch would be on my wrist. And when she came with the watch, I was standing there, with tears in my eyes, but with a feeling oh so great, so enormous. I don't think there are many American students who have ever felt this. It hurt me so to see the unused opportunities here, and I don't know how to make the American students understand this. They complain of too much work with 5 subjects. We have 18, but we don't complain because we're too glad to be able to go to school. How many Indonesians answer me? They don't have the chance. Here you have orchestra, driving, and typing. We only have 3 typewriters in our school, but we're not allowed to use them now. They're only for the administrators. But still we learn how to type by drawing a typewriter on a piece of paper. And your school libraries? We don't have one. We only have one book, and that's for the teacher. We have to copy the book to be able to learn. But still, we study. And here, in your libraries, full of so many good books, they just chatter for hours and hours.
I thought of what I said a moment ago about Americans believing that to be serious is to be old. Maybe it is true. Maybe that is one thing wrong with our French system of education. In France, they keep us so busy with 12 subjects to study at once that we sometimes forget that we are young and can have a good time. The idea that a student should enjoy himself and have a good time is the last thing that would occur to our educators in France. You know, sometimes I wish I could start again with a system less dense in intellectual work and more recreative to soul and mind.
But I feel the American high school student is capable of very much more. The growth of his character and capabilities is blocked by a narrow and superficial curriculum. He is not challenged enough, and when things get too easy, he falls into bad habits and a potential promise often goes to waste. Also, there seems to be no disciplinary methods for a student who lags behind through sheer laziness. The parents might be informed, but the school by itself does nothing towards that.
But Gopi, I've heard this argument that the aim in high schools is not to cram knowledge down the student's throat, but to lead the student to think for himself and to absorb the facts by himself.
But you must remember that this absorption begins by habit. The mellowness and intellectual curiosity of a mature, intelligent man begins with the formation of a rigid habit of thought, with rigid training. And I think this ought to be formed in high school. Here they seem to wait until college to do it. It seems to be a policy of putting the cart before the horse. So much for what is wrong with American high schools, or rather, what I think is wrong with it. There's much that I admire about it, especially the magnificent teaching materials, the complete informality, the fresh approach to dry academic problems, and the curious way of preserving discipline amid chaos.
Look, before we get on to what's good with the American high schools, because I'm sure we could all speak a lot about what is good with them, I'd like to get in this point which I made at the beginning. I disagree with the way you try to teach people of such different abilities together in the same school. They are taught that in a democracy there should be equality of opportunity for everybody. Well, in your American system of education, there is not equality of opportunity for everybody. The bright students are seriously retarded by the dull ones. And for some dull students, nothing is worse than to think somebody is better than they are. It promotes juvenile delinquence and this sort of silly idea of wanting to show off in front of other people to prove themselves. In England, we have a system where the child at the age of 11 takes a competitive examination, and this decides for the child whether it should go to a trade school or a grammar school, which is an academic school. And of course, there's chance for misfits at the age of 13, 15, or 16 even to change.
We don't have this trouble in my country, although we follow the British educational system, because less than 10% of the people of high school age go to school at all. But I hope we never have it. There's been enough class distinction as it is.
But this is the very point I wish to make. This does not create class distinction. By integrating people of good mentality from the poorer classes and putting them into schools, which were normally the prerogative of the rich, one is giving people of equal ability equal opportunity. And anyway, the main aim of the British school system is the promotion of good characters.
On this point, I think the building up of character is linked up with the building up of a corporate spirit in the school. I found this lacking in American high schools. I do not know whether this is good or bad, but it has always seemed to me one of the finest things I got from my own school. Perhaps it takes more than the singing of an alma mater or cheerleaders at a basketball game to foster the spirit. Perhaps also the cane and a hard taskmaster leave more vivid and more binding memories than a comfortable and placid school life, and by some curious quirk of human nature might even be missed more.
I think I'd like to agree with Gopi on this point.
Thank
It's a pleasure. Because some model things are more easily caught than taught. And since I've been in American high school, I have seriously missed this good character training that I have received in the English school system through our daily undenominational religious assemblies. These assemblies might be said to be comparable to the American students' pledge to the flag, but we in Britain do not believe that you can replace religion with nationalism.
Nor do they in America, I think. I think that the American creed separates state from church. Personally, I think that religion is a vertical relation between the creator and the created. It isn't horizontal. It has nothing to do with other persons in society. I found out that the American schools are much concerned with what concerns the society as a whole, not a certain denomination.
Could I just say this about this nationalism of the American student? I think all of we delegates have been rather surprised at the questions that we have received in some schools. How do you like America? Well, we're very pleased to tell them how happy we are here. And then they say, but wouldn't you like to be an American? And it's so strange to them to think that we do not wish to be Americans. And that, I think, is nationalism in its worst form. But anyway, well, let's get back on to
I
education.
don't think it's the worst form. Anyway.
From South Africa that wants to get a word in.
Well, on this point of the tone of the school, I don't think that you can get it without wearing uniforms. And wearing uniforms is much more democratic, because in a democracy there shouldn't be discrimination, or so I've been led to believe. Here in America, where uniforms aren't worn, or I should say in American schools, students who can afford expensive clothes make poorer students feel inferior, even though the latter may be far richer in character and intellect. And I'm not exaggerating this point of inferiority. It really does exist. And that is particularly among American girls who place so much importance in clothes. I've watched them spend hours deciding what to wear the next day, and then again dressing. And I think that wearing uniforms brings the students, or equates them, and brings them to one level, and gives all students equal opportunity to develop their characters and personalities to the fullest. And I think that by wearing uniforms, you'd eliminate much of the distraction that hampers education here in America. I've been amazed at the way boys and girls are constantly preening themselves in classrooms, corridors, cloakrooms. And after all, the main purpose in coming to school is, or going to school, is to learn and not to compete with each other in attracting the opposite sex. But here, schoolwork just becomes of secondary importance. It's neglected.
Yes, Dennis Normandy from the Philippines.
Susan, I think you're terribly wrong. It is completely undemocratic to force an individual into a uniform. Making a teenager wear a uniform makes him feel like a single cow in a big herd, just when he wants to be regarded as a distinct individual and a distinct personality. I think high school is the time that we should be developing our own personality and our own distinctive tastes. I don't think we're going to wear uniforms later on in life. At least I hope so. And I also think that wearing a uniform fosters excessive patriotism, both for school and for country. And I'm sure all American boys would agree with me in saying that American girls would be rather dull if they all came to school dressed alike. Furthermore, you're a bit more attractive when you don't come to school with that rig of a uniform you wear.
Well, Dennis, the point is, I don't go to school to be attractive to boys. And in fact, I'm not sure that I'd like to go to school with boys at all. I'm against co-education. I'm resigned to the fact that there always will be co-education in America. The whole pattern of life tends that way because there's so much freedom between the sexes. But if you have to have co-education, I'm sure you'll get much more education in the true sense of the word if uniforms are worn.
Yes, here's Norbert Schultz from Germany.
I think I can add something here because I have experienced both kinds of education. We never had co-education in German high schools until we got it 6 years ago from the Americans. My school was one of the last to change, a year ago Easter. Then we were 530 boys and 2 girls. Well, when I left Germany last December, there were already 25 girls. Next year, I think there will be about 200. And I don't say that the standard of education has gone down. I'd rather say the opposite. Boys who didn't like to work too hard before were a little bit ashamed not to be better than the girls. This is the time when we have to learn how to live together, as we shall do later on. But I hope that our German girls don't begin to come to school like some American girls do, with a sweater that is 3 sizes too little.
But Norbert, that proves my point exactly. You see, if you'd been concentrating on your studies, you wouldn't have had time to notice how many sizes too little the sweater was. And if, as a matter of fact, if the girl had been wearing uniform, you wouldn't have been distracted from your studies at all.
Now, if I can draw your attention away from sweaters back to the
This is
subject.
not typically Arab, I would like to say. They are renowned for their romanticism throughout the world. But do
Well,
continue.
we are romantic, but when it comes to a practical point, we are very practical. Maybe it's one of our traits that we are romantic when it's the state of romance, and you are never romantic, very materialist maybe. Now, if I can draw that attention back to the subject of our panel, I should like to say that, in my opinion, the American educational system as a whole deserves being praised more than it has been by you.
I'll give in to this extent. I said before that there was too much discussion. I thought there was too much discussion in the American high schools I visited here. The opposite is true in my country. There's a leavening process here. But if one system tends to produce half-baked products, ours certainly tends to produce products that are burnt out. The system of education which we followed till recently tended to produce a few overworked minds and left the mass of the people uneducated. I think the goal we should strive for is to strike a medium between the two, to raise the standard of universal education in your country and to implement it in mine.
Well, I think that universal education not only fits the needs of American society, it's needed and wanted all over the world. If countries that don't have it would somehow start by tomorrow educating everybody, they would surely have the same defects or even worse. I've seen many American students who study as hard as we do, and I believe we have been somehow generalizing from the few we have been with. They were so busy entertaining us that they couldn't study as hard as they usually do. Had the American educational system been inferior to ours, one can ask, why have they progressed so far so fast? Now, I go to an American school myself, as I have mentioned, and that's the International College of the American University of Beirut. It's the largest non-sectarian American university outside the States, having students from 51 nationalities and 24 religions. I can see what the American system has accomplished in my country, bringing all these youth together to understand one another so that when they become the leaders of tomorrow, they can see how they can get along with one another. We have been, for example, taught the American heritage, which is most evident in the system of public education. I think one of the traits of the American educational system is that it teaches the individual how to be independent and responsible. It prepares him for life and shows him how to face it. It does not limit his scope to the academic only. How can we hope to get responsible citizens for a free and progressive society as long as students are taught to look up at the teacher as an unquestioned authority?
I think that Ziad's praise is definitely very much in keeping with what many of us have felt. And since we've been criticizing the American system so much, I think perhaps we should criticize our own for a little bit, so that it doesn't become too lopsided.
I should begin by criticizing you, I think.
I said our own, not each other.
I agree totally, you know.
There's something I'd like to say. You got away with something I didn't agree with you. You said that the American system of education is undemocratic. Do you mean to say that your system of education is democratic? Do you mean to say that system of education which promotes class distinctions by having a few select elite going to a few select colleges and schools, you call that democratic?
I thought, or rather I hoped, that I had proved to you that this does not create class system. I have to admit that in this selection type of education, you are bound to get a certain amount of snobbishness, not because of the actual system, but because of our heritage more than anything else.
because people have this odd idea that the grammar school, where the higher mentality goes, is better than the trade school, where perhaps not the so high mentality goes. But I would like to add that in Britain, we have every type of education that is almost possible to have. We have our private schools for the elite, which have to give a certain number of free scholarships to students every year, so that you do get the poorer classes coming in. We also are experimenting with your American system of multilateral, bilateral, and comprehensive schools. And one school so far has been a success. We have about 70 others in operation, and, well, we're still experimenting, so we hope to get somewhere.
Katrin, yes.
Well, I think that French schools are too intellectual and don't prepare us to face life. I'll tell you one thing, that when the final awful examinations come, the French student becomes very skilled in choosing the things he thinks he will be asked. But we call that impasse. He thinks, you know, he thinks he's going to be asked a few things, so he just learns these few things, so that our education would be considered as a complete failure.
Tell
at
me,
that moment.
Gopi, Katrine was saying that her education was too intellectual, and you said that the system you followed up to a short time ago, which happened to be the British system for anybody who doesn't know, was also too intellectual. Well, would you like to tell me what advances India has been making on her own to stop this education being too intellectual?
In the first place, we are spreading education on a wider, over a wider field than the British ever did. That's the first thing I'd like to point out. At long last, education is coming to the common man, to the villager. I agree, there's still too much of a tendency perhaps towards the more intellectual parts of it. But there is also a tendency for polytechnics, for working with your hands. The dignity of labor has been realized. It was never realized during the British regime.
Could I ask what you yourself are going to do as a representative, perhaps, of India? What's your aim in life?
I have not yet decided upon my aim in life, but I hope to perhaps work in some government office. Is that
Yes, that's what I was trying to point out, that this educational system in India is still getting the governmental people.
And it was a British system.
It
Yeah,
was.
that's
Yes,
right.
it was.
No longer. They're now on
Oh
the...
no, it was.
I'm sorry, we've got to cut it here. We're beginning to get on delicate ground. Perhaps we can continue this another week. Until next week, then, let me say thank you to Ziad Husami from Lebanon, Catherine Arcel from France, Sarah Chat from the United Kingdom, and her erstwhile member, Gopi from India. Thanks also to the other 5 students that participated. Until next week at this same time, we must leave you now.